This is TWiT.
A constant in our industry is the dilemma of deliberately terminating important critical patch support for previously supported systems that have reached the end of their support life cycle. You know, we often talk about this with Microsoft and Windows. It's especially irksome when some people are receiving paid-for updates while others are not. So it's not as if those updates don't exist, but even mighty Microsoft occasionally, we might even say often, bends to the severity of their own mistakes to offer out-of-life cycle patches when the cost to them of doing so, if only, I guess, in reputation damage, would be prohibitive. They just did this at the start of March by reaching way back to patch Exchange Server 2010 for the proxy logon flaws, even though that version was well past its kill-by date. But we've seen similar situations where Cisco, for example, and in this case, makes a different call. And it's not as if Cisco's commercial products are not similarly littered with patchable vulnerabilities. You know, they are. Not to mention that spate of secret accounts and passwords that's appeared throughout their high-end products as people started poking around in their networking firmware and found that they'd hard-coded all those back doors. We were covering that for a while a couple of years ago. Today, Cisco has informed the world that it has no plans to fix critical security vulnerabilities affecting some of its smaller SOHO, the small business routers. What does it tell its past customers to do? Replace them with new Cisco devices. Or perhaps it's time to consider changing brands. The bug they all share is tracked as CVE 2021-1459, and it carries the difficult-to-achieve CVSS score of 9.8 out of 10. It's hard to get up there. Just about the only way to get a higher score is if it's able to attack you after it's been unplugged. In this case, it's a bad vulnerability. 4 routers are affected. The RV110W, which is a VPN firewall, and 3 small business routers, the RV130, the 130W, and the RV2015W routers. In each of the 4 cases, the known flaws allow an unauthenticated remote attacker to execute arbitrary code on the affected device. In other words, 9.8. The flaw, which stems from improper validation of user-supplied input in the, wait for it, web-based management interface. When have we ever heard of that being a problem? Could be exploited to send specially crafted HTTP requests to the device to achieve remote code execution. Cisco's advisory said, quote, a successful exploit could allow the attacker to execute arbitrary code as the root user on the underlying operating system of the affected device, unquote. They also said the Cisco Small Business RV110W, RV130, and RV130W, and RV213W routers have entered the end-of-life process. Painful as it is in this case, customers, they said, are encouraged to migrate to the Cisco Small Business RV132W, RV160, and RV160W routers. So, I looked them up. The routers are their lowest end little plastic consumer box routers. The W suffix in each case means wireless, so that's the wireless flavor. The new replacements, for example, the RV160 and the RV160W, are $114 and $145 respectively at the moment on Amazon. So, in any event, not a huge investment. It's not as if, they're leaving their major enterprise customers out to dry. No self-respecting enterprise would have one of those, hopefully. And sadly, even if they were to update the firmware, that is, if they were to offer updates of the firmware of those old and no longer being made or supported routers, how many of them would even ever get the updated code, right? I mean, these things are forgotten in a back room. We know that there will be tons of those older routers out on the net, thanklessly doing their job day in and day out. And presumably, people chose the Cisco brand because they'd heard of Cisco and wanted the assurance of a superior product. So let's hope that the default configuration was to disable remote web access and that no one ever had it turned on. This is another of those, we see them too often, web management interface issues. Hopefully, no one is exposing their router's web management interface to the internet. And I'm sure that all of our listeners know that unless remote management is really needed and is being actively used, web management, all remote management, should always be kept off of the public internet. One thing to note is that all of the tech press, which covered Cisco's announcement of this trouble, led their stories saying, Cisco says, and I'm quoting one of them, Cisco says it will not patch 3 small business router models and 1 VPN firewall device with critical vulnerabilities, unquote. That was repeated over and over in similar words. So, it appears to matter to the tech press. At the same time, how long are they supposed to be responsible for routers that they are no longer selling? I just thought I would say that so that we can sort of take this as a learning moment, the one right way to handle the need for remote access is to turn off remote access everywhere. Then use one high-quality SSH server that requires a password and a certificate and a time-based additional factor for authentication. And while you're at it, run that server on some random port. There's no reason not to. Don't leave it on the default SSH port. If you use SSH to securely, so then you use SSH to securely first gain access to the internal network, then perform any required administrative work from the inside over LAN-bound interfaces. And it's even possible to run a standard Windows Remote Desktop connection over SSH. It works great. So that, to me, that's the way to do this. I've often talked about this. If your remote ends have fixed IPs and fixed IP ranges, absolutely use IP address filtering so that nobody can even see those ports, when they're scanning from Shodan or, any of the growing number of commercial or private scanners. Only people, like at a sister IP network by IP address are able to even have any access. But if for some reason you need roaming access where you're able to connect from any IP, the only presence ought to be an SSH server somewhere that is high quality, that you're paying attention to. You got 3 different ways to authenticate, something something you have, and something that's changing all the time. You need to use those. That gets you in, and then from the inside, you can do all kinds of things. Today that's the way to set this up.